Bills Mafia. On tonight's Air Raid Hour, we will be breaking down all things edge rushers in the 2024 NFL Draft. Our focus will be on where we expect each prospect to be drafted, their fit with the Bills, and their value versus where they are projected to go. But first,
welcome to the Air Raid Hour, a Cover One Network podcast. Here are your hosts, Judge Mathis and Tilt Money.
welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to the Air Raid Hour. My name is Steve Mathis. You can find me on X at The Bills Guy, joined as always by my co-host Dave Tilton. You can find him on X at Tilt Money. This show is brought to you by Picasso's Pizza and the Cover One Sports Network. This evening, we will be breaking down the edge rusher position for the Buffalo Bills. Obviously, Leonard Floyd is out. AJ Epinesa has been re-signed. Von Miller, kind of a wild card in all this. How is he going to return in the year 2024? Will he even be eligible to play all 17 games? Because he seems to be concerned that he might get suspended. So a lot of things up in the air, and the expectation, unless something changes in free agency, is that the Buffalo Bills are probably going to add an edge rusher. So Dave, before we get started with our exercise tonight, tiering these edge rushers for the 2024 class, what are your thoughts on the current position room for the Buffalo Bills?
Well, clearly the Bills felt and Brandon Beane felt they needed to go into the free agent market pretty early and get their guy back in AJ Epinesa, because this room is thin.
Yeah.
This room has a lot of question marks. And even with the return of AJ Epinesa, I think there still are a ton of question marks at this position. And this has become an annual tradition for the Bills since we pretty much started doing this show, was that in each offseason, we wonder what this edge position is going to look like for this team. We've gone through the works, right, between Jerry Hughes, Mario Addison, Quentin Jefferson. I mean, gone through Trent Murphy. I mean, we've gone through so many guys, and then obviously culminated in the big blockbuster swing in Von Miller. Oh yeah, don't even get me started on Boogie Basham. And now Leonard Floyd out the door, getting the big contract from the Niners. The Bills getting AJ Epinesa back. Like you said in the little preview snippet, Von Miller being the wild card in all of this. Where's the pass rush going to come from? And when I say pass rush, I mean getting to the quarterback from this group, because you have really solid edge setting guys in Epinesa and Rousseau. And Epinesa did bring you some pass rush pop last year.
Good cleanup guys.
Great cleanup guys. Excellent cleanup guys. Excellent length from Epinesa and Rousseau, but who's going to get to the quarterback? That's the question.
Yeah. The X factor is missing unless Von Miller becomes that X factor. Like I sort of labeled the defensive lineman in our room. I think the workhorses this year are going to be Groot and Epinesa, mostly for the fact that I just don't know if we're going to be able to get a guy capable of taking snaps away from those two. So the Buffalo Bills, they're definitely going to continue to rotate their edge rushers like they always do, but it wouldn't shock me if the average number of snaps, barring injury, for guys like Groot and Epinesa are up above maybe the average of what Sean McDermott normally does, because I think these guys are just a cut above everyone else that you have in the room. They're young. You can sort of, work them like workhorses, I think, because of their age. And then the wild card is Von. We've had these conversations before. If you're the Buffalo Bills, you're kind of just stuck, and your hope is that in 2024, 2 years removed from that injury, he can maybe provide what Leonard Floyd provided this year. So if Groot can stay healthy, if AJ Epinesa can stay healthy, and they can be your workhorses, you have Von Miller who can maybe get back to his old form and be that X factor type of player. Then it just becomes about finding some role players, right? Whether it's Kingsley Jonathan stepping up into a bigger role, whether it's Cameron Klein making the football team after redshirting a year on the practice squad. He's got really good measurables and intangibles. Whether it's bringing a guy back from the parking lot and Shaq Lawson to just plug a hole in the back half of your rotation. I think one guy is going to be added here maybe 2 if you bring in back a guy like Shaq Lawson, and they're going to have an opportunity to compete for some significant snaps in this rotation.
They really are. And look, I mean, I know the whole defensive line is thin, right? We know
Mhm.
that. Um, what I'm hoping is that last year's situation with all of the injuries and everything that happened may be a blessing in disguise for us going into 2024, seeing what the Bills could do undermanned on defense,
Mhm.
still being able to generally perform at a decent level. But if the Bills really want to achieve their goals of what they
Mhm.
want to do beyond the regular season and into the postseason, this defense needs to be healthy at the time of the postseason.
Mhm.
And in order to really make sure that you are in the best position, like there needs to be some youth movement injected into this edge group, because
Mhm.
the Bills were largely fortunate on the defensive line last year from an injury perspective. The rest of the unit, obviously, we know about Von Miller. That's
Mhm.
there. The linebackers killed. Secondary faced its injuries. The defensive line, for the most part, was fairly healthy. Obviously, Daquan
Mhm.
Jones missing, but came back at the end of the year. If anything happens to one of these 3 guys, Von Miller, Epinesa, or Groot, like where does that leave you? I mean, you are super thin here. So fun conversation tonight to talk about the edge draft class for sure.
Yeah, and before we start talking about the prospects and maybe the one player the Buffalo Bills will add to this rotation to compete for snaps, this show, as always, is brought to you by Picasso's Pizza. 4 great locations in Williamsville, West Seneca, Lancaster, and Blaisdell. Buffalo Pizza since 1980. You can order online at picassospizza.net. And if you're an out-of-towner like us, you can even have it mailed to your home. And I can tell you from experience, it is just as good as getting it fresh from the restaurant. Again, that is picassospizza.net. So when the Buffalo Bills take an edge rusher at pick number 28 and Bills fans lose their mind, just eat your feelings
I
with
will
some
not.
Picasso's
I will.
Pizza.
I will
It'll
not eat.
depend on the edge rusher. It will depend
Okay,
on the edge
that's fair.
rusher.
Yes, it will
If
depend.
it's Chop Robinson, I think you might feel a little differently, and we're gonna have that
Yeah,
conversation in a little bit here. But before we get into this exercise, the way in which I have tiered these defensive ends is not exactly by their talent level. And we're going to have conversations about who we think is better than who we think fits the Bills the best within these tiers. The tiers in which I have created are tiers in which where I think the player will be drafted come draft day. And Dave and myself, we become pretty good at sort of predicting where a lot of players will be drafted. And I think that we do a better job sometimes than a lot of these mock draft simulators, which are highly, highly inaccurate. Some examples that I've used in years past, I told people Tyquan Thornton was not going to be a day 3 pick. We told people Luke Fortner and Cam Jurgens were going on day 2 of the draft. We were very high on a lot of players over the years. Even players that weren't good. Like I knew Jalen Hurd was not going to be a 6th or a 7th round pick. We were talking about Jalen Hurd, the bust from San Francisco, as a 4th round pick years ago. Like we do a pretty good job of isolating where we think certain guys can be drafted. And that's what we do. So the first tier is going to be guys who I think are bona fide first round picks, meaning I can't envision a world where they leave the first round without being drafted. And then my second tier, and then all the tiers from then on are labeled first, second, second, third, fourth, fourth, fifth, and then late day 3. So for instance, first, second means this is a player that I can see being drafted in the first round, but I don't think they escape the second round, or a player I think will be drafted in the second round, but I can't see them escaping the third round. So that's how these players are tiered this evening. So we will start with our tier 1. And I think 3 guys have separated themselves as bona fide first round draft picks in this class. And those 3 players are Latu out of the University of Central Los Angeles, UCLA. Did I get that wrong again? UCLA. Either way, UCLA. Jared Verse out of Florida State, and Dallas Turner out of Alabama. You might see these guys, 1, 2, 3 differently. Like you might see some people Jared Verse is number 1, some people Dallas Turner is number 1, etc. But I think these 3 guys, it's impossible that they will leave outside of like Latu's medical the first round without being drafted. I really don't expect any of these players, Dave, to be there for the Buffalo Bills at 28. But I think all three of these guys are good enough to have the conversation about trading up if they sneak into the 20s.
I'd entertain a trade up. And from our show that we had Sunday night, we talked about the trading up for some of the receivers, and at some point it felt like it wasn't worth it. I think for these top three edge guys, if one of those guys slips into the 20s, then I'm willing to have that conversation, because it is a premium position on defense, and we've seen how big of a deal it can make to have a stud edge rusher, right? And I'm not saying that guy is going to necessarily. It's hard to say that kind of position single-handedly wins you games. However, a single play in a game can be decided by the play of an edge rusher. And so Von Miller did this for years, right? In his career, earlier in his career, like, he was the closer for Denver, shut down games when teams were trying to come back against the Denver Broncos by forcing a big sack and just putting the team in impossible situations. That's the type of player that you are looking for if you are willing to entertain a trade up into the first round. A game wrecker, a closer, that type of guy who's going to get to the quarterback.
And I don't think anyone embodies that more in this draft more than Latu, who I think would be getting maybe top 10 conversation if he didn't have those medical issues, that neck injury from his time at the University of Washington. I mean, this guy's the most skilled pass rusher in the draft in terms of his repertoire. He's a plug and play guy who's going to go and he's going to impact the game from the get-go. Adding a guy like Latu into this draft, into the Buffalo Bills edge rotation with AJ Epinesa and Gregory Rousseau, like, now we're cooking. Now we know we have a trio, and then Von Miller is your wild card. Jared Verse, he's a little bit older of a prospect at 23 years old, because he started at the University of Albany before going to Florida State, and then he made the decision to go back for his senior season, which I disagree with. I thought he should have came out last year, but this is a guy who's built a lot like Will Anderson, who went top 3 last year for the Houston Texans. He's the most powerful edge in this draft. He's another guy who just speed to power, plug and play. He's a guy who's going to contribute for you right away. And then there's the guy who is the projection, and that's Dallas Turner. He's definitely probably one of the more physical specimens in this draft. He's got an arm length of 34 plus inches. He's 21 years old. His game is not as rounded out as these other two, but his ceiling is higher than these other two, because he's just absolute freakish intangibles and absolute freakish just athletic profile for the position. So any one of these three guys, if Brandon Beane was like, it's going to cost me a 3rd round pick next year to move up and grab one of these three guys, I would be comfortable with that. I don't know if I'd want to trade a pick this year, because like we talked, we need safety, we need a wide receiver. But if it costs us like a 3rd or a 4th round pick next year, or even a 4th round pick this year, like, cool, go do it. Go do it, Brandon, because I think these three guys will affect the quarterback immediately for the Buffalo Bills and will have a future impacting the quarterback for a long time for the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a position where, and we've talked about this, the Bills really need, it's not just about the starting 2 edge rushers. Like, we can't think of it that way. Like, the Bills need a minimum of 3 guys that are competent at this position, and they really do need a minimum of 2 guys, and that's the bare minimum, who can, really effectively get to the quarterback, right? And that's something that I would be willing to pay up for that, because this goes beyond just 2024. Now, if you go up and get one of those 3 guys, you're going to get a guy that is going to immediately have an impact in 2024, you like to think, and well beyond. And I think for a premium position like that, where you need to have some kind of cost control now at that position, especially given Von Miller's contract. You just signed Epinesa. I know it's a short 2-year deal and pretty reasonable, but the conversation is going to come about Gregory Rousseau here in the next year or so and what to do with him. So as much as we don't want to talk about it, this really is a really important position for the Bills to get right. And if Brandon Beane feels strongly enough to go up and get a guy like this that he feels like can be in the future for this team for the next 5 years and possibly beyond, then I'm okay with that.
Looking at the second tier now, I don't know if you notice this or anyone watching notice this, but I put a little panic button on the graphic. And it's something that needs to be talked about, right? The Buffalo Bills need an edge rusher, and there are cliffs in this draft where the talent level falls off a cliff. And we were discussing last night wide receivers, and we were at the 4th and the 5th round, and we were like, yeah, that guy could go contribute for us this year. Like we were having those conversations. I think that there are edge rushers that can contribute this year, but like the ceiling for some of these guys is just not very high. And it really falls off a cliff after the top 3, especially compared to the depth of the edge rusher classes in years past. The second tier, these are guys who could go in the first round, but I don't see escaping the second round, are Chop Robinson out of Penn State and Darius Robinson out of the University of Missouri. We've had conversations, Dave, about both of these guys. Chop Robinson being a guy where the length is an issue, his lack of college production is an issue, but he has an absolutely elite, off the charts, insane first step burst. And you look at a player like Chop Robinson, and NFL front offices tend to look at a player like that and they start to salivate and think about, well, once we get him into our building, he's a ball of clay. We can mold him how we want to mold him. We can utilize that first step, etc. Chop Robinson's going to be one of the more polarizing figures in this draft class. He's going to have more haters and he's going to have supporters. He's in play at 28 for the Buffalo Bills. And then Darius Robinson, his testing numbers indicate that he is an interior player, but he played his best in college as an edge rusher. So can he be the JJ Watt type of exception to these edge rusher rules? I mean, his height, his weight, his arms, his speed, his vert are very similar to JJ Watt, but his broad and his bench are not. They are far inferior to that of JJ Watt's. And we're still waiting on Darius Robinson's agility numbers to come in at his pro day if he so chooses to do those agility drills. So, like I said, we were having great conversations about the second tier of wide receivers yesterday. There's just question mark after question mark at the second tier of edge rushers here.
I really love the panic button because personally, I want nothing to do with either of those guys at pick 28. Mm-hmm. To me, we talked about the receivers yesterday. There being big drop off between the top 3. I think there's an equally big drop off between the top 3 edge rushers and then the next group. I think the difference for me between the edge rushers and the receivers is like the next group of receivers. There's a nice buffer of talent, I think, between like the top 3 and like the next 4 to 10, 15 guys. I actually think Chop Robinson and Darius Robinson are probably closer to the guys in the next tier than they are closer to the guys in the top tier. So that's where, for me, I do hit the panic button. I don't necessarily want to take one of those guys at 28. If that happens on draft day, I probably will be a little bit frustrated.
It'll feel Kyer Elamish to me.
It'll be a little bit frustrated, but I will kind of try to realize that it is at a position we need, and it is, both guys have potential, right? And it'll be really a job for the coaching staff, right, to get the best out of them. So
100%. Then the next tier, probably quickly becoming one of my favorite players in the pre-draft process, Marshawn Kneeland out of Western Michigan, has a top 30 visit lined up with the Buffalo Bills. You have Chop Robinson's running mate at Penn State, Adisa Isaac. You have Dallas Turner's running mate at Alabama, Chris Braswell. You have Jonah Elliss out of Utah, and you have Bralen Trice out of the University of Washington. So there are some dudes there outside of maybe Kneeland and Isaac. I think number 1 bona fide stud type of edge rusher ceiling is not there, but there are some solid rotational pieces for edge rusher there, with Kneeland and Isaac obviously having a much higher ceiling, I think, than the other 3 in that tier.
Yeah, right now Kneeland is my edge 8, so I have him fairly high on my list. He's up there for me, and
I've had some people telling me he's their edge 4.
I mean, that's high. Like, he's like, every time I kind of recalibrate, he like sneaks up a few. Wouldn't surprise me if by the end of this of my rankings, I get him up in the top 5. Like, he just keeps I compare him. I'm like, man, I like him more than like. It's just one of those things. Like I like him more
Mhm.
than this guy. Okay, well, I also like him more than this guy, and he just kind of keeps creeping up my board. And obviously, he tested great.
Yeah.
He's got the length. He's got the big
Yeah.
wingspan, right? So
Mhm.
the
His
question with him is the competition, and like obviously
yeah.
like didn't have huge production sack numbers in
Mhm.
college. So
His combine was like absolutely off the charts. So he's 6'3", 267, 34.5-inch arms. I think the Buffalo Bills are going to be drawn to that. And we know the Buffalo Bills are drawn to that. He's a
mhm,
top 30 visit. He had, based on percentiles with RAS, he had elite vert, he had elite broad, he had elite shuttle, he had elite cone. So he had elite explosion grade. He had an elite agility grade. Every single scouting report you read on Marshawn Kneeland, he is a good run defender, a good to great run defender, and he just has an NFL caliber motor. Like this dude just doesn't quit. He just goes and goes and goes. Like so, those are the things that I think the Buffalo Bills will fall in love with as well. The weaknesses that you see in a lot of the scouting reports, he needs to add more than just like sort of these bull rush type of moves. He needs to add to his
mhm,
pass rush repertoire. He's more of a
yep,
power guy than a finesse guy at this point in his career. But you have a guy who literally runs the pass rush summit every summer here, right? In Buffalo and Von Miller. So even though Von Miller might not be the player he used to be, and he might be an anchor in terms of his actual abilities and what he has left, hopefully he's not, he's still got a lot to teach a lot of guys and balls of clay that come in here, like a guy like Marshawn Kneeland. That's why I think it could be a perfect landing spot. And it would not shock me if the Buffalo Bills took Marshawn Kneeland at pick 60. And it also wouldn't shock me if Marshawn Kneeland was off the board by pick 60.
I mean, I don't think it's a hot take. I think he is going in the second round. I guess that's like
Mm-hmm.
a lukewarm take for right now. I'll say Marshawn Kneeland's a second round pick.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, that could change, but I'll say lukewarm take for March 17th. He's a second round pick.
Yeah.
Perfect landing spot would be for the Bills. I mean, you want a ball of clay that
Yeah.
athlete, right? I mean, this is the type of guy where you could take him in the second round. You wouldn't have to be like have that pressure of being a first round pick.
Mm-hmm.
He could still come in and still be expected to contribute, but maybe it's a little less pressure on him coming in as a second rounder.
I'm actually going to pull up his Raz compare right now. Remember the Gregory Rousseau draft year? Remember the guy who rose up boards and he ended up not being a very good football player? But you remember that football player that rose up the draft boards and went to the New Orleans Saints?
Oh, Peyton Turner.
Yeah, I'm gonna put the Raz compare between Peyton
Yeah,
Turner.
I liked Peyton Turner in that draft. I remember doing
I'm gonna put the Raz compare in
some
between him and Kneeland here real quick. Let's see if the athletic profile is the same. Because like again, I cheered him as a guy who I can't envision him being drafted in the
Peyton Turner was Houston, right? Isn't that where
yeah.
he went? Yep.
Let's see, showing the comparison here on the RAS compare. They are pretty comparable athletes. In terms of everything. Yeah, they line up almost exactly the same. Peyton Turner, 35-inch arms compared to the 34.5 for Kneeland, 6'5" compared to 6'3", 268 compared to 267,
Yeah,
23
and
reps on the bench compared to 21. Their verts are in the same percentile. Their shuttle in the same percentile. Their three cone in the same percentile. I mean, if
I
a
mean
team
Peyton
like
Turner, of what I remember, was also like uber
Mhm.
productive in college,
and
right?
if if a team like Detroit or Kansas City needed a defensive end, I'd probably feel more. I'd probably move Marshawn Kneeland up a tier because I think like he might have like sneaky first round potential. I just don't know if there's a team edge needy that is in at the back end of the draft at the first round. But it wouldn't shock me if he goes like top 40 picks. So that leads us to the next guy, Adisa Isaac from Penn State. The Bills spoke to him at his pro day. He's got a similar athletic profile to Felix Anaduke-Uzama, who we loved last year. 6'4", 247, 33 plus inch arms. He's a lot rougher around the edges, but the tools are there. He does not have the hardware that a guy like Anaduke-Uzama had last year. Big 12 player of the year, et cetera, defense player of the year, et cetera. Like he doesn't have that kind of hardware. He doesn't have that kind of production. A lot of people like to say, well, he had Chop Robinson on the other side that helped him as well. But Adisa Isaac is another guy who's a ball of clay. He's got the athletic profile you're looking for. He's the type of defensive end where it's like, yeah, he could be a 3-down player if we mold him the right way. I think he's going to have his suitors. I think he'll probably go somewhere in the second round.
Yeah, he's actually right now on my board just one spot ahead of Kneeland. I have him at number 7.
Mm-hmm.
Number 7 edge on my board, but I could also see him creeping up my board, maybe getting ahead of a guy like Chris Braswell, who we'll talk about here in a
Mm-hmm.
second, who I have number 6 right now. But
Yeah.
yeah, that group is kind of a muddy
Yeah.
group, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
this is where
Yes.
maybe some ego comes into play from NFL coaches, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
which guy do I think I can turn into a stud?
Mm-hmm.
Beyond these first 3 could become an ego thing for some of these guys.
Anyone else in this tier you want to talk about? I know you mentioned Braswell. I know Bralen Trice. You've been a fan of his, sort of in this pre-draft process as well. Any of these guys you want to talk about in this tier?
Yeah, I mean Trice, I've like cooled on him slightly. I've actually knocked him down to edge 12 on my
Mm-hmm.
board. Wasn't like didn't love some of the measurables coming out from
Mm-hmm.
him. Shorter arms, smaller hands. He weighed in pretty light at 245. He did have good advanced metrics from PFF
Mm-hmm.
during the season. 11th best pass rush grade for guys with 100 snaps, 100 pass rush snaps, 17.6% win percentage, just outside the top 30. Second most hits on the quarterback in college football in 23. So there's some metrics that kind of point to Bralen Trice being an effective pass rusher, but I have knocked him down my board
Mm-hmm.
somewhat just from some of the measurables that came in at the combine.
And what are your thoughts on Braswell? Because my concern with Braswell is like, and I guess, and we've had these conversations before with guys like Greg Tumset, like he doesn't really matter anymore in the modern NFL, but he just seems like a hand up kind of guy, like not a hand in the dirt kind of guy, Chris Braswell. So what are your thoughts on Braswell out of Alabama?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see him as a fit for the Bills either. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
he's kind of on a little bit on the smaller side as far as what the Bills would look for, just weighing in at just over 250. Um, he is 6'3", so he does have the height,
Mm-hmm.
8.63 RAS, so tested pretty decently athletically. Um, had the best year of his career in 23 with
Yeah.
13 sacks. But again, I think it's tough. Like I have him at 6 because I think on a non-Bills team, he probably will fit
Mm-hmm.
well. I just don't see him probably as an archetype fit for the Bills, but I think in a certain situation he would
Mm-hmm.
perform.
Yeah, the other guy that I have on my list. So in my tier here, I went back and forth between 2 players in the second and third round tier. Jonah Elliss and a guy we're going to talk about in the next tier, Austin Booker. And Austin Booker's combine dropped him a tier for me because I didn't think he'd be in play to be a possible second round pick. But for me, these tiers are fluid. So like
They're fluid
it,
for
it,
sure.
it will change before draft day because pro day numbers and stuff are still coming in. Jonah Elliss is a guy just like kind of like Chris Braswell, 6'2", 248. He's got 33-inch arms. Is he a 3-4 edge? Can he play the 43? But I look at a guy like Jonah Elliss. I look at his motor. I look at like the lineage, right? His dad was his defensive line coach at Utah. His brother Caden Smith plays for the Falcons. He's got 4 other brothers who have played football all at the National Football League level. He's got this pass rush ability. And I wonder, I don't think he'll ever be more than a rotational guy, but I wonder if the Buffalo Bills look at that and they're like, man, we need that pass rush pop. We need that effort. We need that hustle from a guy like a Caden Elliss. And maybe not Caden Elliss, that's his brother, a guy like Jonah Elliss. And they're drawn to a Jonah Elliss. I'm really looking forward to when Utah's pro day happens and when Utah's pro day numbers are released, because if Jonah Elliss blows up his pro day and has a great workout, I feel comfortable with him in this tier. But if he has a poor workout or doesn't, test well, I'll probably flip flop him and the guy I have in this next tier, Austin Booker. So let's get to this next tier here. And this next tier I have is guys who I think could easily go on day 3. They could go in the 3rd round of this draft, or they could go early day 3. They could be 4th round picks. That is Austin Booker out of the University of Kansas. 2 players the Buffalo Bills have met with in Javon Solomon out of Troy and Jalyx Hunt out of Houston Christian. You have Gabriel Murphy out of UCLA, Mo Kamara out of Colorado State, and Brandon Dorlus out of the University of Oregon, sort of a defensive tackle, edge rush tweener. These are the guys I have in my 3rd, 4th round tier. What are the names that stick out to you?
I actually really like that group
Yeah.
as a whole. Like it's a
Yep, this is
nice.
I actually have in my notes, this is my favorite tier.
Yeah, it's Mo Kamara, man. I mean, obviously
Mhm,
love that. Murphy, I've been a fan of his pretty much throughout. Booker was on kind of my non-trendy names
mhm,
to look out for, and then obviously didn't have the best combine, obviously, but um I think like his on paper length looks pretty good.
mhm,
Waiting late there, but like the question is where is he going to align at the next level? Murphy is a guy that, like I said, I've liked.
mhm.
He's just inside my top 10. I actually have Gabriel Murphy as my number 9 edge, and I have Booker number 10 right now. So I have
To me,
them right next to each other on my list at the moment.
the 2 guys that, like, obviously, they're the 2 guys the Bills met with, and then there's the polarizing Austin Booker, who the buzz is there. There's a lot of people who love Austin Booker. To me, I took him out of that second round range
Yep.
because it's kinda tough to draft a guy who had that kind of combine, that kind of explosion burst speed. It's kinda tough to take
Hmm.
that kinda guy in round 2, especially when he's got, like, a weird frame, but there are so many people who love his game. Obviously, the Bills have met with Solomon and Hunt, so we're going to talk about those 2 guys in a second here. But
Hmm.
Mo Kamara and Gabriel Murphy are plug and play edge rushers,
Yep.
rotational edge rushers in the National Football League. I
Yep.
think Mo Kamara and Gabriel Murphy enter the National Football League, and they are 5 to 8 sack DE3 DE4s for you. They are uber productive, and they are like that for close to a decade. I really feel comfortable with both of their projections. I really like both of them at the next level. But again, Brandon Bean has these archetypes, athletic profiles, and Mo Kamara and Gabriel Murphy do not fit what Brandon Bean
Right.
looks for.
Agreed. And I mean, really, neither does Javon Solomon, who we're about to talk about, who's like
He's
currently,
he's got some things going for him though. Those long
yeah,
arms. He's got the
yeah.
long arms going for him.
I have a tab on my column on my spreadsheet
Mhm.
for like no matter what list, and it's fluid, right? Because we haven't
Yeah.
released official ones, but he's penciled in right now on mine. Javon
Mhm.
Solomon is penciled in at edge for me on the no matter what list. I mean, he was impressive, right? I mean, ninth highest pass rush grade of
16
all
sacks out
edges,
of Troy in
s-
2023.
second most in college football last year
Mhm.
from a sack. He's got the length. He's shorter, but he's got the arm length, right?
Mhm.
So how does that offset with each other? Um, 33.875 arm, 80 over 80-inch wingspan, the 10.75-inch hands. So he's got those big, strong hands.
2 college football seasons with double-digit sacks. 2. Like, this
Yep,
guy has a nose, and he knows how to get to the quarterback. Javon Solomon might have played at Troy, and he might not be able to be an every down edge rusher right now, but I think he could come in and contribute in pass rushing situations for the Buffalo Bills from day one.
he could. And the Bills, I mean, obviously different regime, but they've
Mhm.
taken a guy from Troy in the first round before within the last 10, 15 years, right? Leotis McKelvin
Mhm.
from Troy, first rounder. So
Yeah.
Troy's put out some guys in the NFL. Was it am I gonna get this wrong? DeMarcus Ware, Troy, right? Edge rusher.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe so. Yeah.
I'll have to
There we
fact
go.
check myself on that. But yeah. So I'm actually gonna check.
Um, yeah, while you're doing that, I think
Yeah, Troy. Yep.
one of the biggest boom or bust prospects in this draft is Jalyx Hunt out of Houston Christian.
Yeah, for
A
sure.
a guy the Bills have met with at the combine. I'll be really interested to see if they top 30 him or they private workout him. This is a guy who was a former safety, and he's still filling out his body, so there is upside. 6'4", 250 pounds, 35-inch arms. To me, though, only 7.5 sacks over the 2 years that he really played at Houston Christian. He's more of a redshirt developmental play special teams kind of guy early in his career. The upside is there for him to be like a legitimately like, oh my God, we got a first round caliber player in the fourth round, right? That's the kind of, I think, athletic upside Jalyx Hunt has
Hmm.
if you coach him correctly and you mold him correctly. And you got a guy like Von Miller here to do that. But he's also the kind of guy who could, it just doesn't click. All that
Hmm.
athleticism just never clicks. So he's an ultimate boomer bust guy in this draft. Because of how weak this class is, I think he'll go sooner than maybe he should. But super interesting name, and I wouldn't be mad if the Buffalo Bills called his name on draft day. But I certainly would prefer a Solomon or a Kamara or a Murphy from this tier.
Yeah, and I think where this tier continues to intrigue me is the fact that the Bills don't have that third round pick, but like
Mhm.
you feel maybe that one or multiple of these guys could be available to the
Oh, yeah.
Bills in the fourth
Mhm.
round, right? Because it's kind of where we
Mhm.
are projecting to slot them right now. And if the Bills do go, let's say, wide receiver in the first round, or they go safety early in the
Mhm.
draft and maybe wide receiver in the second round, you don't have that third round pick. Edge is still a need. All of a sudden, one of these
Mhm.
guys fall in your lap in the fourth round. That's certainly a possibility.
Without getting name specific, I would I would prefer in this draft if we went wide receiver if we don't trade. Wide receiver first round, safety second round, defensive tackle, defensive end, fourth round. That would
Mhm.
be my like without putting any names to it. If you were to tell me we're going to draft this position, this position, this position, this
I think
position,
I
the first
agree
round
right
pick,
now. I think I
that
agree.
that would be my preference. That would be my preference, and that's because I like a lot of these guys in this tier, and I like a lot of guys in the defensive tackle tier that we'll talk about next week as well. So let's get on to our next tier here, and the next tier is guys who could be there in the fourth round, the Buffalo Bills pick, or they could be around maybe a little bit later into the fifth round, where the Buffalo Bills have 3 selections in this year's draft: Jaylen Harrell out of Michigan, Cedric Johnson out of Mississippi, Xavier Thomas out of Clemson, Nelson Caesar out of Houston, Javontae Jean-Baptiste out of Notre Dame, and Khalid Duke out of Kansas State. These are all names that I like, but these are all like DE4 ceiling type of guys where I like them. I honestly think some of the names on this list could contribute right away, but I think their ceiling is capped.
Ceiling's capped. I mean, obviously Johnson, nice testing numbers, right?
Yes.
Good
Really nice
RAS,
number.
9.65
Mhm.
there. Khalid Duke maybe a little disappointing, but I kind of figured that maybe was going to be the case since he was always looked to be a little bit undersized to me,
Mhm.
at least in the couple of games that I watched, Kansas State games. He is not a Felix Duque
No.
clone. I'm sorry. As much as I wanted to kind of will that into existence, I just couldn't. I couldn't get there. You
Mhm.
mentioned Jaylen Harrell, tons of experience, has played
Yeah,
in over
that's a
40 games, 30 over
that's
30 starts in
that's
his
the thing, it's
career.
like, it's big time programs,
Yep.
contributors in big time programs, so you can just picture them coming into the NFL and having, like, that type of like, these are like the Mike Danas, right? Where they come in and, like, they, make very minimal impact, but then all of a sudden, like, year 3 or year 4, they're a pretty solid, like, edge type of guy. Like, that's what I look at. Like, obviously, Cedric Johnson had the big combine.
Mhm.
Nelson Caesar, I think, is the one I like the most out of this group. Right, he 6'3", 254 pounds, almost 34-inch arms. The thing is like 9.5 sacks last year. He's known as a pass rusher, but like he needs a lot of work in run defense. So like the Buffalo Bills just looking for a situational pass rusher. You know, the Buffalo Bills like guys who can set the edge. They feel like they can teach him how to set the edge and do all these various different things. How long will it take for him to contribute? What kind of role can he play special teams? Like these are all the questions you start to ask yourself
Well, let me
when
ask
you
you
when you
this.
look at these kind of guys.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it easier to find a guy who can set the edge, or is it easier to find a guy who can get to the quarterback? It's easier to find a guy who can set the
You can
edge.
go. You can go sign Shaq Lawson off the street right now. He's at
Exactly.
the
So
edge.
give me the guy who
Yeah.
can get to the quarterback
Mhm.
and then work on the other stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, there are some interesting names here. Xavier Thomas is an older prospect, but Javontae Jean-Baptiste has a really good athletic profile too, out of Notre Dame, former Ohio State recruit
Mhm.
too. So, looking now at the late day 3 guys, you have Gabriel Murphy's brother Grayson, who had a pretty good pro day despite being snubbed from the combine. I know
Mm.
a lot of scouts were upset that he was snubbed from the combine, so that tells me that he's probably going to have a draftable grade in a lot of rooms. You have Miles Cole, the athletic freak who just really hasn't delivered on the football field out of Texas Tech. Eric Watts, who had a nice combine out of UConn. A guy I really want to talk about in a moment in Sunita Anderson out of Grambling State. I think he is one of my favorite day 3 flyers. You got a Okie-Anoma out of Charlotte. Braden McGregor, another guy to Michigan, and then I know a guy you like, and Brennan Jackson out of Washington State as well. So it's
Mhm.
not a deep class. There is not the most special names in the world here
Nope.
on day 3. Not the funnest, maybe flyer names on day 3. I like Murphy. I like both those UCLA guys a lot. I like McGregor. I like Anderson. But any of those guys in that tier 3 that you're not tier 3, but late day 3, the final tier here that you like?
I do like Brennan Jackson. I think you worry a little bit about he does have a little bit of shorter arms, right? But
Mhm.
overall, he did test fairly well. He was in the 8s from a RAS perspective.
Yeah.
He followed up his 7-sack season from 2022 with 9 sacks in 2023. He's got the kind of like height, size that the Bills would look for, just under 6'4", 264. So that's kind of an archetype fit for the Bills. Back-to-back seasons with 12 plus tackles for loss as well.
Mhm.
So you like that he can get into the backfield and play against the run game a little bit. So I do like Brennan
Mhm.
Jackson, even though maybe you do have a little bit of concern with the shorter arms from him.
Yeah, Sandita Anderson, one of the better HBCU prospects in this draft. Above average athlete, upside as a rotational pass rushing edge rusher, possibly 12 sacks and 24 tackles for losses over his last 2 seasons at Grambling State. So he's shown he can get to the quarterback. And then Braden McGregor, 6'5", 257. He's got those 33-inch arms, so he meets some of the Brandon Beane archetypes in terms of size. He obviously needs to keep getting stronger. That's something that popped up on almost all of his scouting reports, is needing to get a stronger base. His ceiling is probably not very sky high, but this is a guy in McGregor who 3.5 sacks over his final 5 games at Michigan. So big time games. He was making some big time plays. So maybe a guy like him on day 3 of the draft as well. Somebody to take a flyer on, to come in. And I mean, realistically, Kingsley Jonathan has the advantage right now to be DE number 4. So I think the way you got to look at most of these edge rushers is, are they someone who is going to compete with Kingsley Jonathan and have an edge? Or once we leave the first, 3 tiers, once we get to day 2, it's, are they going to complete with Kingsley Jonathan and have an edge? Are they going to compete with Kingsley Jonathan, maybe be on par with Kingsley Jonathan? Or are they going to compete with Kingsley Jonathan and be a step behind? Like the guys we just talked about, guys like Sandita Anderson, guys like Brennan Jackson, guys like Braden McGregor, they're probably a step behind. Guys like Jaylen Harrell, Cedric Johnson, they're probably on the same par, right? That tier is probably on the same par as the Kingsley Jonathan. And then guys that we talked about at the top of these tiers, Austin Booker, Solomon, Murphy, Hunt, Kamara, those guys would probably have, even
A
though
little bit ahead.
John, he's been here, I think they would be a little bit ahead of him in this competition to provide snaps for the Buffalo Bills in their edge rusher rotations. Finally, just some names I left off the list because of it's a numbers game. Jalen Green, he was the nation's sack leader for most of the season until he had an injury. Injuries are unfortunate. He's an undersized edge rusher out of James Madison. Richard Jubiner, who was Solomon's running mate at Troy. Jamari Chroma as well. Zion Tupalu Futui out of Washington. Solomon Bird out of USC. Trajan Jeffcoat out of Arkansas. And David Webu out of the University of Houston, who was there with Nelson Caesar. So just some names, like if they go in the 6th or the 7th round of the draft, it wouldn't be shocking. I'm not going to lie to you. I haven't done too much research onto which one of these guys are archetype fits for the Buffalo Bills, which one of these guys are fits for the Buffalo Bills. So I haven't done too much work on any of those guys to really have much commentary, but maybe one of those names pops up on the tail end of the draft. So good conversation on edge rushers this evening, Dave. I'm really looking forward to next week when we have conversations about interior defenders, which I think is just as important because we have literally 2 right now, unless maybe over the course of the next 24 hours, since we recorded this on Sunday night to air on Monday, we've signed Sebastian Joseph Day, fingers crossed. And we'll talk about safeties next week as well. And again,
That'll be good.
Julian Blackman or somebody signs between Sunday nights when we record this and Monday nights, safety, a pretty big need as well. So those are the positions we'll be breaking down, just like we broke down wide receiver and edge rusher this week. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll be doing shows like this all the way leading up until the draft. We'll also be doing ones that are specific to comparing all the positions for day 1 of the draft, all the positions, day 2 of the draft, all the positions, day 3 of the draft, and we'll be bringing you our no matter what lists. So join us every Monday night, 9 p.m., and then also a second show every week, either Sunday nights or Thursday nights, depending on our various schedules. Any final thoughts before we get out of here, Dave?
No, I like the conversation on edge. I think that comparison that I haven't really thought about that sort of Kingsley Jonathan angle, right? I think that's a really good angle we need to think about once we get out of sort of that day 1, day 2 range, I think, to kind of keep perspective, right? And I think that's important, is keeping perspective on who would these guys be competing with. And in some cases, Like when we talk about the interior defensive line, they might not be competing with anybody. So it's really important to figure that part out as well.
Everyone always says that they always make these comments like these are the positions that are hardest to adjust to in the National Football League. Tight end is always a position that comes up. Defensive tackle is always a position that comes up. Oh, it takes a while for guys to just offensive guard. So if this is a position that takes a long time for guys to develop, I am honestly shocked the Buffalo Bills have not added a third veteran to this room yet. I know they're probably just waiting out the market, but I'm really surprised that the Buffalo Bills prioritized wide receiver, prioritized a linebacker, prioritized, those things before they just found an isolated defensive tackle. I'm surprised they're honestly playing the numbers game with some of these. Obviously, they brought Daquan Jones back. That was huge, but I'm surprised they haven't maybe isolated a guy or two that they liked and brought them in because the rotation is so important to the Bills.
Yeah, and it's still thin. I mean, Daquan Jones and AJ Epinesa back in the mix were almost like it wasn't lucky that we got them back, but it was like that was like a prerequisite to everything else this offseason.
Yeah.
Like you had to have somebody back and of note, right? And they did, thankfully.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. And until we see you next week, go Bills.
Go Bills.
Thank you for watching tonight's episode of the Air Raid Hour. Make sure to hit that like button on the way out. If you are catching the show on demand, leave a reply in the comments section and we will respond over the course of the week. You can always listen to every episode next day on all major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify by searching Air Raid Buffalo. Thank you for your continued support, and as always, go Bills!